Hey, welcome everyone. We're continuing with our series on exploring the soul. I shared on the WhatsApp, hopefully everyone's on the WhatsApp, the chart that we're going to be learning tonight. I'm going to be sharing this chart for a good part of the class. And this is the main organizational chart from Rav Ginsburg's book, Anatomy of the Soul. That is the book we've been using here. And this is the chart that runs to the whole book. Last week, we introduced the idea that when talking about the anatomy of the soul, we can divide it between powers and garments. And we didn't really explain it. We just introduced the idea that the soul has certain powers, and those powers are only expressed through the garments. And the garments of the soul are thought, speech, and action. And just as a review, Rav Ginsburg used the concept of chashmal to explain about the essence of the soul. Chash, this is this mysterious word in the vision of Ezekiel. Sometimes in modern Hebrew, it's electricity, but in the book of Ezekiel, it's translated as a brilliant color or a brilliant energy. It's really both of them. So Rav Ginsburg explained this very simply that the powers of the soul is chash, and the garments of the soul is mal. Now chash means silent, and mal means speaking. So chash means, as far as the soul is concerned, the powers of the soul, but they're in pure potential, because without garments, without a way to express that potential, they, in a sense, remain hidden. So the part of the soul that is hidden is the part of the soul if it has no way to express itself. And so as important as the powers of the soul is, in a certain way, almost more important are the garments, because that is the way we express ourselves through thought, speech, and action. And that's where we pretty much left off last week. And now we are going to, hopefully tonight, just do an overview of this whole chart. Now, one thing I did mention already is that we're really not going to go into tremendous depths here, because as we're going to see in a minute, the powers of the soul are identified with the Sefirot. And since we had an entire series on the Sefirot, and if anyone missed that, you can always go back in the WhatsApp and you have all of the classes recorded there, also on YouTube. So I didn't feel that we're going to go back over a lot of the material that we studied already about the Sefirot, because as we're going to see, in essence, that the powers of the soul is identified with the Sefirot. Now, as we learn with the Sefirot are present and manifest on many different levels. They are what we'll call the DNA of the universe, that God uses the Sefirot to create and maintain the world. So it's 10 divine energies, and it's 10 channels through which God creates and maintains the world. And the big chiddush of Chassidut is that these Sefirot all are identifying the different parts of the soul. So I'm going to share I'm going to share here. Hold on. There we go. Okay, I hope everyone can see. This is the whole chart, and I'm pretty much going to keep it up the entire class. Okay, so again, my purpose tonight is to be able to go through this whole chart. As I mentioned already, it was already posted on yesterday's WhatsApp. And if anyone doesn't have the WhatsApp, you should be in touch with us so we can direct you to that, or someone can put up on the chat how people could get into our fundamentals WhatsApp. So here, we're going to start on the far left, and we see that we start it very general, and it becomes more and more detailed as more particulars as we move in this direction to the right. So we begin on the left with the powers and the garments of the soul. So we're going to start with the powers, and we'll see that there's two types of powers of the soul. There are transcendental powers of the soul, and there is what's called imminent powers of the soul. Now, it's very, very important to point out that when we talk about Hashem, these are the same words that we use to try to describe or understand the nature of God, that there is an aspect of God that is transcendent, and there's an aspect of God that is imminent. Transcendent means, the other term that we use in Kabbalah is sovev kol olmin. He surrounds all worlds. It's a surrounding, transcendental aura that permutes everything, but it's like, if you can use the terminology of far and near, it appears to be more distant from us, more inaccessible. And then we have the imminent powers of the soul. And these are the powers, we're talking about God here. And this is the energy of God that manifests itself in the world. This is very connected to the idea of Shekhinah, God's presence, the idea of Elohim being the manifestation of nature. So God is imminent, meaning in every point of space and in every moment of time. But we use the same words when relating to the soul, because we are created in the image of God. So just like God has a transcendent nature and an imminent nature, so does the soul. Okay, now we're going to move more towards the right, and we'll see that the transcendent powers of the soul are pleasure and will. Now, again, for those who, and it's, I think most of you who went through the series of the Sefirot, so we know that in Keter, the highest of the Sefirot, there's actually three, what I call the three heads of Keter. But in Kabbalistic terminology, we say that there's two partsufim, meaning there's two levels. And here we see in the chart that we have pleasure and will. In Hebrew, pleasure is ta'anug, and will is ratzon. Now, if we go over one more column, we'll see that each of the powers of the soul and the garments of the soul each have a dual way that they express themselves. Two different manifestations of each of the transcendental and the imminent powers of the soul. And the same with thought, speech. The only difference is action, as we'll see, does not have a dual manifestation. It has a singular manifestation, as we will touch on later. So now let's return quickly to pleasure and will. And we see that pleasure, there's two types of pleasure. One is called simple, and one is called composite. So in Hebrew, it's pashut and murchav. Murchav also means like complex, composite. So here, if you look one column more to the right, there's where we see faith. This is the third head of Keter. Faith, pleasure, and will. And faith is the expression of the simple pleasure of the soul. How do we understand this? The simple pleasure of the soul is those times when we feel very close to God, we feel very close to our own soul, and that is this most simple pleasure. It's when we know who we are, we know what our purpose is. That is our faith, that is our emunah. Or when we feel so close to God and we feel that faith in God, that's called simple pleasure. Composite pleasure is a type of pleasure that is directed towards the world. In other words, simple pleasure is a type of pleasure that comes from inside of us, independent of anything or anyone else. It's a type of inner experience of being alone with oneself and at peace with oneself. That's why it's called simple pleasure, this kind of faith. But composite pleasure is a type of pleasure that's directed into the world, into reality. And there's a drive in the soul to find and express pleasure in relating to the world. So you'll see under faith in the right-hand column, there's a type of delight of the intellect, there's a delight of the emotions, and here there's a delight of speech. So these are different types of pleasure we get. We get pleasure when learning Torah. We get a pure intellectual type of pleasure. And then there's a pleasure of the emotions. When we're feeling love or kindness or thanksgiving or gratitude or fortitude or strength. These are all powers of the soul that we get delight in. So again, just in simple, there's a pleasure that's directed inward or Godward, and there's a type of pleasure that is manifest by relating to the world. Again, this is a survey that we're doing tonight. So the next one of the transcendent powers of the soul is will, which of course is ratzon. And here in English, there's what's called supreme will or common will. And in Hebrew, it's called ratzon elyon and ratzon tachton, like the higher type of will and the lower type of will. What is an example of the higher type of will, the supreme? So here we have an explanation. It says beyond reason and understanding. And common will is in accordance with reason and understanding. Obviously, will is one of the most important components of a human being, is that without will, we're not able to accomplish very much of anything. Will is the power of the soul that allows us to manifest in a certain way all the other powers of the soul. And here in the common will, in accordance with reason and understanding, this is the type of what we'll call more conscious will, where we direct our will towards a task, towards a mission, towards a purpose in life, in accomplishing things. But then there's a type of supreme will, which is beyond reason and understanding. In Hebrew, and I think what we'll do is, B'li Neder, we'll post the same chart, but in Hebrew. So everyone can also see the Hebrew terms for all of these concepts. So, as I said, there's a type of will that's according to reason and understanding, but there's a type of will that is beyond reason and understanding. It doesn't mean it's illogical, but what it means, it's a higher level. In other words, pleasure and will go together. The human being, like an animal, is hard-drived for pleasure. The more, as it were, animal-like we are, the more we seek purely physical pleasure. And the more spiritual we are, the more our divine soul speaks through us and is activated, then we find pleasure in spiritual things, in learning Torah, in music, in nature, in meditation, these kinds of pleasure. Oneg Shabbos, the pleasure of Shabbos. But sometimes our pleasure and will, which is directed below, sometimes there's a higher calling that, in a sense, goes against pleasure. And there we need to attach ourselves to a higher level of will. In other words, sometimes to accomplish what we have to do means sacrificing pleasure. If someone, I'm just taking an example, wants to be a doctor, so it's a long journey. And there's a lot of not such pleasant parts of the whole process. And there we have to call upon our higher will. Our higher will is dedicated to be a doctor, to help others. But our lower pleasure and will is like, it's sometimes a battle, because it means sacrificing so much immediate pleasure for a higher goal. So that's the idea of the supreme will that's beyond reason and understanding. Just a person in their depths of their being knows, I want and I need to be, and that's my mission, to be a doctor. And you can't write it down exactly why that is. It's just something that is beyond reason and understanding, but that is what is driving us. Okay, so those are the transcendent powers of the soul. Again, for those who studied with us the Sefirot and are familiar, this is Keter. All of the transcendent powers of will, pleasure, and ultimately faith, Emunah, is in Keter. Now, when we move into the imminent powers of the soul, this is going to follow exactly the Sefirot. So if you see, the first, it's divided into two. There are the intellectual Sefirot, or powers of the soul, and there are the character attributes of the soul. And here what's interesting, because I looked in the Hebrew, the way that the terms in the right columns are written of Chachma and Bina, it's usually the opposite. Usually you'll see Chachma on the right and Bina on the left, or Chesed on the right and Gevura on the left, Netzach on the right and Hod. And in the Hebrew, they have it exactly what we're used to. I'm not exactly sure why they did it in this way. Maybe because people are reading from left to right, and they thought for people who didn't know the Sefirot so well, that it would be easier to explain in this order. But just everyone should know that usually Chachma is on the right and Bina is on the left. Anyways, the intellectual powers of the soul. And this is what I said before. Now we see that when we talk about the soul and we talk about the powers of the soul, these are the Sefirot. And when we studied the Sefirot, we did learn it according to how God uses the Sefirot in creation, and how the world, the physical material world, is formed and maintained through the 10 Sefirot, and how the soul is corresponds to the Sefirot. So here, the intellect, we see that Chachma, Bina, and Dat, meaning wisdom, understanding, and knowledge, has a hidden aspect and a revealed aspect. And here, the hidden, you look on the right, is called Koach HaMaskil, the power of intellect. Now, even though we have these two black lines dividing between transcendent and imminent, we're told that wisdom, understanding, and knowledge, there's two levels. There's a revealed level. There is conscious wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. But it's really drawing from a more hidden power of intellect that's really in Keter. And that's why there's a verse that says, Chachma me'ayin timatzeh. Chachma is found in the ayin, in the Ein Sof, in the infinite. And the infinite is transcendent. So there's a type of wisdom, understanding, and knowledge, Chachma, Bina, and Dat, that's very grounded in this world. It is very conscious. But when we're talking about really Torah type of wisdom, certainly Kabbalistic type of wisdom, we're talking about one has to be able to draw from the source of wisdom. And the source of wisdom is beyond what we usually relate to intellect, call it being smart, knowing a lot of facts, being able to memorize, being able to put things together, to analyze. All of that is indispensable in this world. We use it 24/7. But there's a deeper, higher, more transcendent source of hidden intellect that we want to connect to. And that's why, if you see next to the word Chachma is in parentheses is Bitul. And we learned that the inner dimension of Chachma is Bitul. Bitul is selflessness, ego nullification. So we all know that know-it-alls have big egos. Here, we're talking about a type of wisdom that a person has to become selfless in order to connect to the higher hidden Koach HaMaskil. Then we go to the character attributes. And here we're used to, especially during Sefirot to Omer, we're counting the 7 weeks of the Omer, and each of the weeks of the Omer represents one of the character attributes. And every day of the 49-day count, we're trying to exchange one level of purity one level of impurity, the kind of impurity of the slavery in Egypt. And as we are approaching Mount Sinai, we're approaching the giving of the Torah in Shavuot, each day we're trying to fix one of the levels of character attributes. So we've been dealing with it as a whole, all 7. But really the 7 are divided into 2. And one is called the aroused emotions, and the other is the more innate, behavioristic, intuitive types of emotions. So the aroused emotions are chesed, gevura, and tiferet. This is love, fear or awe, and beauty or holism, shleimut, wholeness, and their inner dimensions of ahava, yira, and rachmin, love and fear and awe, and compassion. So these are the aroused emotions. In other words, love is an arousal that I suppose there's a cold kind of love. I think probably many of us have experienced a cold type of love. It is love, but it's somewhat cold. And also there's the aroused, the more fiery, the more emotional type of love. Same thing with gevura. There's a passive strength, and then there's a very assertive type of strength. So the 7 lower sefirot, sometimes called the midot, the character attributes, are divided into the aroused. The innate is netzach, hod, yesod, and malchut. And netzach is victory, eternity. Hod is thanksgiving, acknowledge, glory. Yesod is foundation, and malchut is kingship, sovereignty. And so these are less emotional and more intuitive, more behavioristic. And we can see from the powers of the soul, we are quite literally going from the head down, from the transcendent, above our heads, into the intellect, into the emotions that are very connected with the body. And these are the powers of the soul as in a hierarchical kind of construct. And then, so in the innate, like I said, these we get closer and closer to action. In other words, in the intellect, it's thought. And as we move down the Sefirot, especially when we get into the innate, netzach, hod, yesod, and malchut, this is putting into practice, putting into the world. It's the same thing with the Sefirot. We're just starting the week of Yesod. Actually, we're almost halfway through the week of Yesod. As we get closer to Shavuos, we should be concentrating and focusing more of all of the contemplation that we've done during the weeks of the Omer and all the different tikkunim we've been trying to make and all of the rectifications that we're trying to make, that it's moving from thought and more into action. So that brings us to the 3 garments of the soul. And like I said, that the powers of the soul relatively are silent unless they're expressed. It's the same thing that light doesn't really shine unless there's a vessel that is going to receive it. If there's no vessel, then there's really no awareness of the light. So the garments are obviously very, very important. And as you'll notice, thought and speech both have a dual manifestation, whereas action is singular, as we'll explain. So let's go to thought. Just give me a second here. So in thought, there's two types of thought, and I think everyone will understand this very good. There's what's called focused thought and random reflection. So focused thought obviously is when we are thinking about something and we're focused. Our mind isn't all over the place. We're trying to remember something, think of something. Let's say we're in a class, and even though all of us have 100 things in mind, but during the class, we're focused. We're focused. Hopefully, when we're praying, we're focused. We're meditating, but actually, that's why we have a second type of thought. We know how hard it is in Torah learning, in meditation, and in prayer to actually keep our focus. So there's a second type of thought, which is like a flow of thoughts. Sometimes random, and sometimes actually very, very intentful, but it's a flow of associations. So each one has its advantage and disadvantage. The advantage of focused thought is we can actually not get lost in 100 other thoughts. We can keep focused. Hopefully we can learn, we can remember, we can apply it to our lives. Part of it, and that's indispensable. But on the other hand, sometimes when we're totally focused and we don't allow the mind to wander in a creative way, then a lot of times we create mental, emotional, psychological boxes for ourselves because we don't give permission to dream. We don't give permission to let the mind just go where it wants to go. Now, obviously, the disadvantage of that is people get spaced out. People can't focus. It leads in unrectified thought. It leads to a lot of fantasies, whether they're sexual fantasies or ego-driven fantasies or jealousy kind of fantasies or revenge kind of fantasies. We all know the problems with random type of thought. Now, random type of thought is very, very connected to the imagination. And we learned in one of the previous classes that one of the roots of the word Adam, human being, is the word for imagination is dimayon. It's the same root. And remember, we learned that Rashi said that being created in the image and likeness of God is the intellectual component of a human being, the ability to think in a focused, complex, philosophical, advanced, complex kind of way. So Dimayon is very connected to what an Adam is. But we know that there is unrectified imagination, which can lead a person to the worst places. We all know that in our minds. but then a lot of people will act on their imagination. And then the positive is, this is the creative energy in a human being to create, and the artistic urge and just the creative urge is coming from the imagination. And in the writings of Rambam and Ramchal, they explain in great detail the importance of imagination in prophecy, which is a bit surprising because we would think that the last thing that prophecy should be connected to is the imagination, because here where the prophet is hearing or being granted a vision from God. So where does the imagination come in? But both the Rambam and the Ramchal explain that for all of the prophets, except for Moshe, all of the prophets, their prophecy was being channeled through their ability and rectified imagination. And that's why the prophets, the Gemara says, every prophet wrote in his or her own style. Because, I mean, there are many exceptions, but most of what the prophets were writing were not exact words that God said, say this, say that. They received a prophetic vision, a clear or semi-clear vision, and then they routed it through a fixed imagination, and they came up with these metaphors, the symbolic language, allegorical, parable type of language that we're used to seeing in the prophets. So here we have two types of thought. And this, again, this is how the soul, how does all of the powers of the soul express? So it begins through thought. It begins through thought. And then we go to speech. And again, we have two different aspects. One is called profound speech, and one is called superficial speech. And here, the expressions used in the right-hand column is that profound speech is words spoken from the heart. And this is the expression in the Gemara that words from the heart enter the heart. In other words, when a person talks from their heart, honestly, with real feeling, the person hearing it will be received. And then there's what's called superficial speech, which here it says words that issue only from the lips and outward. So this is what we call lip service. When a person they're not talking from their heart. They're going through the motions of saying what should be said, of being polite and saying the right things at the right time. They don't necessarily mean any of it. They could mean it, but it's just superficial. So Rav Ginsburg brings from the Gemara a very interesting connection to Shavuos, which is coming up, is that the sages used this idea of words from the heart and words from the lips and outward in a way to describe the comparison and the difference between God's speech that created the world, because as it says in Pirkei Avot, God created the world through 10 expressions. These are the 10 times or 9 times and one general statement where God said, and God said, let there be, and that thing came into being. So the sages, of course, understood this quite literally, that God spoke the world into being, and he spoke it through the Hebrew letters, and what was being created, the word, is the actuality of what was being created. And yet, now this is like such a high level. God is creating through speech. But the sages said, in comparison to the 10 commandments, especially the first two that all the people heard, the other 8, Moshe heard and related to the people, because the people became overwhelmed with the presence and revelation of God. So the sages said the 10 commandments can be compared to words that come from the heart. This is called profound speech. So what's the connection here? Is both have to do with speech, but the secret is in a Rashi on on the Shabbat of Bereshit, where it says Yom Hashishi vayachulu hashamayim va'aretz v'chol tziba'am, and it was on the 6th day when God finished the heavens and the earth. So it says Yom HaShishi, the 6th day, like the with a capital T, the 6th day. And Rashi points out that the other days of creation, it doesn't say Yom HaSheni, Yom HaShlishi, the 2nd day, the 3rd day, only the 6th day. So he explains why that is. So he says something so profound. He says that this is reminding us of another 6th day. When it says Yom HaShishi, the 6th day, it's a hint for another 6th day. What's the 6th day? The 6th day of Sivan, the day that the Torah is given. We celebrate Shavuos on the 6th of Sivan. But Rashi continues and says that until the 10 commandments, until that Yom HaShishi, that 6th day, it was as if the whole world was al tanai, on condition that the Jewish people would receive the Torah on Mount Sinai. So this really answers the difference between the two types of speech. In other words, God creating the world was, of course, phenomenal. But that just to create the world without introducing the Torah to the world, so the world was lacking, was on condition. God only created the world because he knew that at the right time, he would reveal Torah into the world and the Jewish people would receive it. And then the world became fixed on its foundation. So that's why the 10 Commandments is, in a sense, considered a much deeper type of divine speech than even creation. And then we get to action. And here, Rav Ginsburg says this is the only one of all the powers and the garments that don't manifest in two ways. Because he explains, we're not talking about, let's say, good actions and bad actions, or actions that have a lot of intent, kavana, and actions that don't. He said when we get to an action, it's either it's done or it's not done. In other words, let's say lighting Hanukkah candles. So it's possible, and there's stories of Hasidic rabbis that would stand in front of the Hanukkah candles, let's say holding the shamash, for like an hour or 2 hours in deep thought before they would light the candles. And someone else just lights the shamash, doesn't really think of anything, says the bracha and lights it. But from the perspective of, we'll say objective reality, they both did the same act. They both lit the candles. And so the idea was there kavana there, everything. When we're talking about act and thought, there's focused thought and there's random thought. That was what went into the mitzvah, but with the action is the same action. And he said that the reason for this is very connected to the whole idea of having 613 mitzvot, because it's a level which unites everyone together. In other words, he said, we're not talking morally or ethically, but in a certain level, it doesn't matter if you have 1,000 people and everyone's lighting Hanukkah candles at the same time. So everyone is connected to the same action. The action is the same. If you want to talk about like subjective reality, then we can talk about all kinds of things that are connected to the action. So he was just saying that action is a very unifying idea, because the main, and that's why it says in the Gemara that the action is the main thing. Hamaaseh hu ha'ikar. The action is the main thing. It's wonderful to have all of this kavanah. It's wonderful. But if you don't do the action, all of that kavanah, again, is like the powers of the soul that have no expression. And that's why all of Torah is so mitzvah oriented, because there is something very unifying, that it doesn't matter if it's a man doing the mitzvah or a woman, a child, Sephardi, Ashkenazi, religious, not religious. If someone is doing the mitzvah, there's a unifying factor there. The thoughts might be different. Everything that happens before the action might be different, and everything that happens afterwards. But at the moment of the action, there's something uniquely unifying about the garment of action. So, actually, it's written in the right, equalizing great and small. So here we've done a full review of this chart. And to be honest, I'm not sure where we're going to go next with this mini-series. We'll call it a surprise, because it's going to be a surprise for me also, that we got this far, and we'll see what happens in the future. Oh, I have to stop sharing.